We borrow money from Chinese peasants to buy the things those Chinese peasants manufacture.
We borrow money from Chinese peasants to buy the things those Chinese peasants manufacture.
The lost generation are regarded as uneducated, uncivilized, lacking in decorum. Hong Kongers routinely mock the mainland Chinese visitors who come over with lots of money and outward displays of wealth, but still behave like peasants. Hello everyone. In today's video, I would like to give you my 2 cents, for what it's worth, regarding the current controversy around JD Vance's comments this week about Chinese peasants, which you may or may not have seen has caused outrage among Chinese people all over the world, who were very offended by the fact that he referred to them as peasants. And I would argue that he wasn't talking about all Chinese people, but a certain class of Chinese people, the Chinese peasant class. And I'm going to start by playing you the video so you know what it is that he actually said.
Ask ourselves, what has the globalist economy gotten the United States of America? And the answer is fundamentally it's based on 2 principles: incurring a huge amount of debt to buy things that other countries make for us. And to make it a little bit more crystal clear, we borrow money from Chinese peasants to buy the things those Chinese peasants manufacture. That is not a recipe for economic prosperity, it's not a recipe for low prices, and it's not a recipe for good jobs in the United States of America.
We borrow money from Chinese peasants to buy the things those Chinese peasants manufacture.
So when I saw this interview, I wasn't outraged. Unlike virtually my entire race, regardless of political persuasion, who were deeply offended by his choice of words, because I know what he's talking about, and I think it requires an understanding of Chinese society and the class system, which I'm going to try and break down for you. And you also need to understand the subject matter that he's discussing here, which is the circular economy involving US bonds and Chinese peasant workers who hold these bonds. So, first of all, in terms of the Chinese class system, it's much more extreme than the Western class system. There is a definite peasant class, which is the equivalent of what we refer to in the West as the working class. And this is actually a huge majority in China. There are, I don't know the exact number, hundreds of millions of economic migrants working in cities all across China who migrated from their rural villages to these megacities to work. And in China, they're actually referred to as migrants rather than working class people or peasants. But you've got to understand the way China works to know what Chinese people mean when they say migrant. They're basically people who have migrated across China, because if you think about China, it's like the size of Europe. So if you come from a different region, it's like coming from a different country. Much like you might argue the migrants in the West that are often reviled by the people who make up the nationals of whatever country they're in. And they have less rights than locals. They often live in dormitories, so they don't have proper housing. And because they migrate to these cities to work, and they're completely dependent on their employers, much like economic migrants here in the West, who actually, you could argue, have more rights and more protections, because there is a benefit system in the West that is, a lot would say, overly generous. So, to give you a bit more background on what is China's peasant class. China only really rose to prosperity over the last 3 decades. And it was the most rapid and dramatic transformation in history of any nation. And it's something that the Chinese government is very proud of, rightfully so. The government claims to have lifted its population out of poverty. And when they say this, they are very open about the fact that they turned peasants into urbanites. Because prior to China's urbanization, it was a peasant society. And the reason for this is that during Mao's Cultural Revolution, he sent a whole generation of urban youth from the cities to the country in a sort of it was an attempt to re-educate them in his fight against Western capitalism, which he perceived had destroyed Chinese morals. And so an entire generation of urban youth were sent to work on farms as a re-education. And these people grew up completely detached from the modern world, and they were uneducated other than in the ways of agriculture, which I would argue today is a more valuable education than what they're getting in the schools and universities in our cities. But that's a whole other subject for another video. And outside of China, these people had a reputation of being peasants. Like everyone in Hong Kong who, if ever the subject of mainland Chinese would come up, we would call them 鄉下人, country bumpkins. That's what my mom would call them, because she was an urbanite living in Hong Kong and a successful entrepreneur. And there was a kind of a snobbery among Hong Kongers who looked down at the mainland Chinese people as backwards and uncivilized because they were peasants. It's not a slur, it's a fact. And they mostly were living in poverty. And even within Hong Kong, there was the same attitude towards what were economic migrants from China into Hong Kong. There were many peasants who escaped China into Hong Kong to pursue their capitalist dream, and they ended up working as laborers. A lot of them were in construction and other types of manual labor, working on the streets, and they're known as coolies, gulay in Cantonese, which is another word for China's working class peasant laborers. Now, fast forward 4 decades since China decided to take on capitalism, we now have a new urban middle class and upper class in these new glossy Chinese megacities. They are an educated urbanista working in industries like tech and media, marketing and government. And these are sophisticated, cultured people who sit around in Starbucks wearing Balenciaga. And this group has virtually no contact with the migrants, which is arguably, as I said, the majority of the people in China. But China is very proud of this new urbanista who, although they're a minority, they're highly visible on the national and international stage. And they are what people think of now when they think of the Chinese population, even though they only make up a small percentage of the Chinese people. And I suppose you could say it's like a more extreme version of what we see in the US, the Democrat elite in New York and Los Angeles and other cities. versus the forgotten working class in the middle, but way more extreme. The new urban elites have very little interaction or connection with the migrant peasant class. In fact, they often vilify them because they're ashamed of them, and they've given them the name the lost generation, because that's what they are essentially, the generation of farmers that got left behind while the rest of the world progressed. But it's a huge generation. The lost generation are regarded as uneducated, uncivilized, lacking in decorum, and in many cases they're practically invisible in society, even though they make up the majority, because they were moved en masse from rural villages into these new cities and piled high in these residential tower blocks. But because they lacked education, a lot of them couldn't find work and were only able to take the very lowliest jobs. However, some of them had the skills to open factories, and a lot of them also became factory workers, sweatshop workers. And with China's rise, buoyed by their production capabilities as a global manufacturing hub, a lot of these peasant workers suddenly found themselves incredibly wealthy. But this didn't change their behavior in many cases. They were known for public drunkenness, spitting on the street, brawling. You may have seen videos of them fighting over food in hotel buffets or supermarkets. So while many of them became quite rich, that wealth didn't come with etiquette classes. They couldn't catch up on a lifetime's worth of laboring on farms without the social graces of the city. And so a lot of the urban elite just disassociated with them. They were an embarrassing reminder of their peasant roots, which they wanted to forget. And you could argue that in some ways the social credit system was rolled out to control their behavior. The social credit system, which actually doesn't really exist. It was a failed trial that was conducted in many cities across the country that became so unmanageable and was so flawed, so full of inconsistencies that they scrapped it. And that's another video that you can watch in my channel. I spoke for like half an hour about what actually happened to the Chinese social credit system in the end, which so many people believe in, but it doesn't really exist today. So yeah, part of the desire to implement a social credit system was to reel in their embarrassing behavior. And Hong Kongers routinely mock the mainland Chinese visitors who come over with lots of money and outward displays of wealth, but still behave like peasants. And these nouveau riche Chinese peasants have also been a bit of an embarrassment for the nation when they travel abroad to places like Paris, where they turn up by the coach load, and restaurant owners are fed up with them spitting on the floor and shouting across the restaurant and refusing to eat the food because they want Chinese food. So yeah, it's a phenomenon that all Chinese people, if they're being honest, are well aware of. And I think that they should know that JD Vance wasn't talking about the urbanistas in their Balenciaga. He was talking about these people. And a lot of these people, the factory workers, that got a little bit of money invested in US bonds. US bonds were marketed to them as a great way of saving their money and earning a bit of interest on top of it. And they've never really been of interest to the urbanistas who spend their money on their Balenciaga wardrobe and their expensive apartment, and they buy shares rather than investing in government bonds. So what JD Vance was talking about in the clip I showed you was this circular economy whereby the bonds recycle the money that is spent on Chinese manufacturing back to the US. So it's the peasant workers who buy the US bonds, and then that money goes back to America to then place more orders for them to fulfill. And meanwhile, Americans are working hard to pay the interest on those bonds. That's what JD Vance was talking about. So you need to understand everything that I've just explained in this video to fully grasp the context of that short clip that was put out there as rage bait. Perhaps it was an unsavory turn of phrase to refer to them as Chinese peasants. He should have just said Chinese, right? But Chinese peasants is not an inaccurate term to describe these workers. The more correct term would have been Chinese migrants. As I said, that's how they're referred to in China. They're migrant workers. But if he'd said that, it would have made no sense to Americans. They'd be like, well, they're not migrants, they're Chinese. They're not colored people, they're not foreigners. So he called them peasants. He should have just called them Chinese workers. But hey ho, I get what he meant by Chinese peasants, and I'm not offended by it. I mean, I grew up around people who refer to them as Heng Hayan, country bumpkins. So yeah, perhaps it was insensitive language, but I don't think he was deliberately out to offend, but he was certainly very direct. And we are very direct people ourselves. We Chinese say it like it is. Our language is direct in its very nature. But let's look at the bigger picture, because what's really going on behind this US-China spat? I would say that this beef between China and the US is symbolic of the global rivalry taking place at the moment between the two globalist trade alliances that are competing for dominance right now. BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, and China, and the G7, or what was the G7 now that the US is pulling out. And I predict that this trade battle will lead to a new US-led trading bloc, which is basically the G7, and it will fulfill all of WEF's ambitions, the World Economic Forum, for free trade between US, UK, Canada, Japan. And so I feel that what Trump's doing, he's just forwarding this agenda, and he's just carrying out his role. The US president, whether it was Biden or Trump or Paris or Trump, had to deliver this. Whether you're left wing or right wing, all of our world leaders have to deliver the vision for the New World Order. And it's very much a rivalry between two competing groups. And everything we're seeing now is progressing that rivalry between the new G7, whatever it's going to be called, and BRICS. So I explained this in a previous post that a lot of people didn't understand. I made a TikTok about it, that Trump is just a globalist in disguise as a nationalist. And he plays on patriotism for popularity and votes. But at the end of the day, he's a globalist. You can't be president of the United States without being a globalist. And he's just carrying out his mission within the New World Order. So there you have it. I hope you've enjoyed this video and maybe you've learned something from it. And maybe you're not so outraged by JD Vance's comment anymore having heard this, or maybe you still are. If you still think it was totally out of order for him to call our peasant class peasants, do let me know in the comments. I'm always open to hearing what you have to say, whether you agree or disagree with me. And if you enjoyed this video, please give it a like. And if you haven't already subscribed to my channel, please do. And I mentioned my video about the Chinese social credit system, and I suppose now would be a suitable time for me to plug it. So do watch this one if you've not seen it yet, because I go into detail about how a lot of what we hear about the social credit system is just myth, and I break down what really happened. So thank you very much and have a great day or evening.